I've been doing this missing persons gig for over 10 years now. Seen a lot of weird stuff, a lot of sad stuff. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that sometimes people just don't want to be found. They vanish on purpose, make it so no one can track them. But Alaska's a whole different beast. It's this massive, wild place, right? You don't even need a reason to disappear up there. The wilderness just swallows you whole. It doesn't care about your plans, your motives, nothing. It's like this thing, this silent, endless entity that just doesn't give a damn. So, when I got the call about Sarah Lowell, I should have known this one was gonna be a trip. It was Sheriff Hayes on the other end, and his voice was rougher than usual, like gravel and ice. "We got another one," he says, and even through the phone, I could practically feel the cold wind whipping through his tiny office up there. "Another what?" I asked, already grabbing my go bag. I always keep it packed just in case. There's a pause, a long one. "Missing person. College kid, a biologist. She was out here studying, wildlife patterns and all that." He cleared his throat, and the static on the line made the unease in his voice even worse. "She's been gone 3 days. 3 days. In the Alaskan wilderness, that's basically a death sentence. Unless you're some kind of survival expert, you're toast. But from what I heard, Sarah was no ordinary college kid. Word was she was tough, resourceful, could handle herself in the wild. She'd been out in these parts before, knew the risks. That's the only reason I even considered taking the case. My gut was screaming at me to stay put, though. The last time I worked a disappearance up in that area, the guy, well, let's just say they didn't find him for 6 months. And when they did, he wasn't complete. Let's leave it at that. But still, I said yes. I don't know why. Maybe I felt sorry for her. Maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment. Either way, next thing I know, I'm on a puddle jumper heading to some nameless town that's basically the last stop before you hit the real nothingness. The second I stepped off that plane, the air hit me like a fist, freezing cold, with a sharp, piney scent that gets right into your lungs. Sheriff Hayes was waiting at the terminal. His face was all lines and creases, like a road map of sleepless nights. "Thanks for coming," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was strong, but his eyes were somewhere else. "You might want to brace yourself. This one's." He trailed off, looking up at the sky, which was this depressing shade of gray. "Strange," I offered, because that's usually the word people use in these situations. "Strange," he agreed, nodding slowly. "She left everything behind. Tent, GPS, food. Just walked off into the woods." He paused again, and this time when he spoke, his voice was lower. "And then there's the journal." "Her journal?" I perked up. "A journal is always a good find." Sheriff Hayes nodded grimly. "Found it at her campsite. The last few entries. They don't make a whole lot of sense. We got into his cruiser, and let me tell you, that drive to Sarah's last known location was something else. An hour of silence, except for the crunch of tires on the icy road. The road twisted and turned, and these massive evergreens were all around us, pressing in closer with every mile. It felt like the forest was watching us. Finally, Hayes broke the silence. "She's the third one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Third." My hand tightened on the armrest. "Third person to go missing in this area in the last 5 years. And the other 2. I already knew the answer. He let out a sharp breath. "Never found. Just gone." We got to the campsite as the sun was starting to set. The sky was all these crazy colors, orange, purple, red, and the shadows were getting long and creepy. And there was Sarah's tent, just sitting there, looking all neat and tidy. The flap was open a little, like she just stepped out for a second. There was a half-eaten meal on a camping stove, cold and stiff now. Her backpack was leaning against a tree, untouched. Doesn't look like she planned on leaving, I said, stating the obvious. Hayes pointed at the ground. Look at the tracks. I crouched down. Her boot prints were clear as day, leading away from the camp. But there was something off about them. They were all over the place, the strides were uneven, like she was running or stumbling. Where do they lead? I asked. Hayes' face got even darker. They stop. About 50 yards that way. After that, nothing. I followed the trail, my breath making little white puffs in the cold air. And sure enough, the tracks just ended at the edge of the trees. No signs of a struggle, no footprints going back. Nothing. It was like she just vanished. Poof. Gone. Back at the camp, I was starting to feel seriously uneasy. And that's when I saw it, the journal. It was on a folding chair near the tent, the cover all worn and frayed. I picked it up, my heart pounding a little faster than it should have. This was it. This was where I'd find some answers, or at least, I hoped so. I opened the journal carefully, like it was some ancient, fragile thing. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, all organized and scientific. At first, it was just normal stuff. Notes about wildlife sightings, sketches of animal tracks, weather observations, the usual biologist stuff. But as I got closer to the end, things started to get weird. Day 11, I've been hearing things at night. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it's not. It's heavier, closer. My pulse picked up a little. Okay, that's not exactly normal. Day 24, I saw something today. Just for a moment. It was watching me from the trees, but when I turned, it was gone. Am I imagining things? A shiver went down my spine. This was starting to sound familiar, too familiar. Like that case a few years back? I pushed the thought away. Day 33, it's closer now. And then, the final entry. It was scrawled across the page, all jagged and frantic, like she wrote it in a hurry, terrified. Just 2 words it watches. Find anything useful? Sheriff Hayes asked, coming up behind me. I closed the journal, my hand lingering on the worn cover. Useful, I echoed, glancing around the campsite. The shadows were getting longer, the trees seeming to lean in closer. No, but unsettling. Definitely, Hayes grunted, a sound that seemed to say, "Tell me something I don't know." "You want to stay here tonight?" he asked. "Mason will be here in the morning to guide us." Mason. Right. I'd heard about him. Local guy, a park ranger. Supposedly knew this area like the back of his hand. If anyone could help us retrace Sarah's steps, it was him. Still, the thought of spending the night at this campsite sent a chill down my spine. But what else was I going to do? Hike back to town in the dark? "I'll stay," I said finally. Hayes didn't argue. "Good luck," he muttered, climbing into his cruiser. "You'll need it." And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the deepening twilight. That night was the longest of my life. The wilderness around me came alive. The wind howled through the trees, making these weird, moaning sounds. Every now and then, I'd hear cracks and groans, like something huge was moving around out there in the darkness. I stayed as close to the fire as I could, but the warmth did little to chase away the cold that had settled deep in my bones. Sarah's journal sat beside me, a constant, unwelcome companion. I didn't sleep, not really. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping up, grabbing my flashlight, heart hammering in my chest. And then, just before dawn, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound. Breathing. I froze. Every muscle in my body tense. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The sound was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Slowly, carefully, I grabbed my flashlight and turned towards the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing. Just snow and bark. The breathing stopped. I stayed up until the first light of dawn, my mind racing. Sarah's words echoed in my head, "It watches." Whatever it was, I had a sinking feeling I was about to find out. The next morning, Mason arrived just as the sun was starting to peek over the horizon. He was a man of few words, his presence as quiet as the snow that blanketed the camp. He moved like he was part of the wilderness, every step deliberate, every motion purposeful. He was wearing this heavy parka with a fur-lined hood that framed a face weathered by years of exposure to the elements. "You must be the investigator," he said, extending a gloved hand. His voice was low and steady, the voice of someone who'd seen it all and lived to tell the tale. "That's me," I replied, shaking his hand. "Thanks for coming out." Mason nodded, his eyes scanning the campsite. "Sarah was a smart one," he said. "Knew how to handle herself out here. This isn't like her." Sheriff Hayes said the same thing, I said, handing him Sarah's journal. "Take a look at the last entries." He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with each one. When he was done, he closed the book and looked up at me. "Not good," he muttered. "The locals have stories about this area. Old legends about things that watch from the trees. Most people dismiss them as campfire tales, but..." He trailed off, his gaze drifting towards the forest. "Sometimes, the stories feel real." We set off shortly after. Sheriff Hayes joined us again, his usual gruff demeanor replaced by a palpable tension. He was carrying a rifle now, slung over his shoulder. A stark reminder that we weren't just dealing with the wilderness anymore. We were dealing with something else. Something unknown. Something that made a seasoned lawman like Hayes bring a rifle to a missing person search. The faint tracks Sarah had left behind were still visible, though partially covered by fresh snowfall. Mason, with his years of experience, took the lead. He pointed out things I would have missed, a broken twig here, a patch of disturbed snow there. "Look here," he said, pointing to a low bush. A strip of fabric, blue fabric, was snagged on a thorn. A scarf, its edges frayed. She passed through here, but something made her hurry. He gestured to the way the tracks veered sharply, almost erratically. This isn't someone walking with purpose. She was running. Running from what? Hayes asked, his grip on the rifle tightening. Mason didn't answer, but the look on his face said it all. The deeper we went into the forest, the more it felt like we were being swallowed whole. The towering pines stretched up towards the sky, their branches tangling together to form a thick canopy that blocked out most of the daylight. The air got colder, heavier, and the silence was broken only by the crunch of our boots in the snow and the occasional, lonely call of a bird somewhere far off. Then came the first real sign that something was seriously wrong. My GPS, which had been working fine just an hour ago, started to flicker. Then, it died completely. I smacked it a couple of times, but it was no use. Just a blank, useless screen. "Same here," Mason said, holding up his own device. It was dead too. "This area has a way of messing with electronics," Hayes muttered, looking up at the trees, his eyes narrowed. He tried to sound rational, like he was explaining it away. "It's probably just interference. Magnetic fields, maybe." But the way he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, the way his hand never left the rifle, told me he didn't really believe it himself. We pressed on, and the feeling of unease just kept growing, like a knot in my stomach. The forest felt different now, like it was watching us. The shadows between the trees seemed too still, too deliberate. Once, I could have sworn I saw something move, a dark shape darting between the trunks, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Did you see that?" I asked Mason, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't stop walking, but his voice was tight. "You'll see things out here. Best to keep moving." We found more signs of Sarah, a snapped branch here, a footprint partially preserved in the snow there, but no sign of her, no real clue as to why she had abandoned her camp so suddenly. By late afternoon, we reached a small clearing. Mason suggested we make camp there for the night. The sun was already starting to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. As we set up our tents, Hayes paced the perimeter, his rifle never far from his hands. That night, the wilderness felt even more alive, more menacing. The wind carried strange whispers, low and indistinct, like the trees themselves were talking in their sleep. My unease from the previous night came back, stronger now, amplified by the isolation and the growing certainty that we were walking into something we didn't understand. After a dinner of cold rations, Mason started talking about those legends he mentioned earlier. "The locals call it the Watcher," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, barely audible above the crackling fire. "They say it's always been here, long before the first settlers. It doesn't hurt people, not directly, but it gets inside their heads, makes them see things, hear things, drives them away." "Drives them away to where?" I asked, my throat suddenly dry. Mason shrugged. "No one knows. That's the thing about missing persons out here. They just vanish." Hayes scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. "Legends are just that, legends. People get scared, they run, they make mistakes. The wilderness does the rest." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But Sarah's journal kept nagging at me. "It's closer now." What had she seen? What had she felt? That night I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustled the branches, carrying with it the occasional creak of a tree trunk. I tried to focus on the mundane, to convince myself that everything we were experiencing had a rational explanation. But then, I heard it again. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, and this time, it was coming from just outside my tent. My pulse hammered in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness as I unzipped the tent flap and stepped out. The campsite was still. Hayes' and Mason's tents were undisturbed, their occupants presumably asleep. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint, flickering orange light across the snow. But the breathing, it was gone. I scanned the perimeter, the flashlight beam dancing across the trees. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anything, or anyone, had been there. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold biting at my skin, my mind racing. Finally, I retreated to my tent, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something was toying with us. The next morning, Mason found something that sent a new wave of chill down my spine. About 20 yards from the campsite, carved into the bark of a tree, was a symbol. Simple, yet undeniably deliberate. A circle with a single line cutting through its center, like an eye staring back at us. "Sarah didn't do this," Mason said, his voice low and grim. "It's too precise." "Then who did?" Hayes demanded, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. Mason didn't answer, but the look on his face said enough. We packed up quickly and resumed our search, the air thick with unspoken tension. As we moved deeper into the wilderness, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as if shaped by some unseen force. The snow beneath our feet was untouched, pristine, as if nothing had ever passed through here. And yet, the feeling of being watched never left us. It pressed against me, an invisible weight that grew heavier with every step. Sarah's journal had been right. Whatever it was closer now. We could feel it. The next morning, the forest was eerily quiet. Even the wind had died down, leaving the air unnervingly still. We packed up quickly, each of us moving with a kind of tense urgency that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Mason led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings for any trace of Sarah. Hayes stayed close behind, his rifle cradled in his arms, ready. I brought up the rear, trying to shake off the persistent feeling that we were being followed. The path grew steeper as we ascended a ridgeline. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and twisted as though warped by time itself. Every now and then, Mason would pause, crouching to inspect the ground or a broken branch. His silence was starting to wear on me. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Mason," I said, keeping my voice low, "do you think she's still alive?" He didn't look up. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I do know that something out here doesn't want us to find her." Hayes snorted. "You're letting those old stories get in your head," he said. But his grip on the rifle tightened, and I noticed him glancing over his shoulder more than once. By midday, we reached a narrow valley where the trees parted, revealing a series of jagged rock formations. Mason motioned for us to stop. "This is where her trail gets strange," he said, pointing to the ground. I followed his finger to a set of tracks, Sarah's boots, unmistakably. But they weren't moving forward. Instead, they circled back on themselves, looping in erratic patterns that made no sense. "Why would she do that?" I asked. Mason shook his head. "She wouldn't. Not unless she was trying to confuse someone or something." Hayes muttered a curse under his breath. "We're wasting time. Let's keep moving." But as we prepared to press on, Mason froze. His hand shot up in a silent command to stop. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I strained my ears. At first, I heard nothing. But then, faint and distant, came a low, rhythmic sound. A hum. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it set my teeth on edge. "What the hell is that?" Hayes asked, his voice low and tight. Mason didn't answer. Instead, he started moving again, his steps more cautious now, his senses on high alert. The hum grew louder as we approached the rock formations, reverberating through the air like a vibration in the earth itself. And then we saw it. A cave mouth, dark and jagged, hidden among the rocks. Sarah's backpack was propped against the entrance, as though she had left it there deliberately. "This is it," Mason said grimly. The cave was colder than I expected, the air inside carrying a damp, metallic tang. Mason took the lead, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam illuminated walls covered in strange marks, scratches, and gouges that didn't look natural. "She was here," Mason said, his voice echoing softly in the confined space. He pointed to a burnt-out fire pit and a pile of ashes. "She stayed long enough to try to make herself safe." We searched the area, our footsteps crunching on the uneven ground. It wasn't long before we found more of Sarah's belongings, a water bottle, a torn notebook, and then, deeper in the cave, a small recording device. "Do you think it works?" Hayes asked as Mason picked it up. "Only one way to find out," Mason replied. He pressed play. For a moment, there was only static. Then a voice crackled through the speaker, Sarah's voice. The first part of the recording was calm, methodical. She described her observations, noting the wildlife and the weather, just like in her journal. But as the recording continued, her tone shifted. She spoke faster, her words laced with fear. "It's watching me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what it is, but it's always there. I see it in the corner of my eye, But when I turn, it's gone. It's like it knows what I'm thinking. There was a pause, filled with the sound of her ragged breathing. I can't stay here, she continued, her voice rising in panic. I feel pulled, like it wants me to follow. I know I shouldn't, but I can't help it. I have to go. The recording ended abruptly, the static fading into silence. None of us spoke for a long moment. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. What the hell does that mean? Hayes finally asked, his voice rough. Pulled by what? Mason didn't answer. He was staring at the shadows at the back of the cave, where the light from our flashlights couldn't reach. We left the cave in silence, our unease growing with every step. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. As we prepared to head back to camp, we made a chilling discovery. Our supplies were gone. Backpacks, food, even Hayes's rifle case, all of it vanished. Except for one thing. Sarah's journal. It sat in the center of the clearing, open to a blank page that hadn't been there before. That's impossible, I muttered, picking it up. The paper was pristine, untouched by the elements. I flipped through the pages, half expecting something to appear, but there was nothing, just the unnerving blankness. Hayes swore under his breath. This isn't right. Someone's messing with us. But Mason was staring at the journal, his face pale. No, he said quietly. This isn't someone. It's something. That night, none of us slept. The fire crackled weakly in the center of our camp, casting flickering shadows on the trees. The hum we had heard earlier seemed to have followed us, faint but persistent, like a low drone at the edge of hearing. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees, shapes that didn't belong. But every time I looked directly, there was nothing. Just the forest, dark and unyielding. Around midnight, Hayes stood abruptly, his face pale and drawn. I can't take this, he said, his voice strained. We're sitting ducks out here. We need to leave. Leave and go where? Mason asked. We're too far from the nearest town to make it by night. I don't care, Hayes snapped. Anything's better than staying here. Before Mason could respond, the hum grew louder, filling the air with a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The fire flickered violently, casting strange, distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. When morning finally came, we found fresh tracks leading away from the camp. They were faint, but unmistakable bare footprints, too large to be human. They weren't there last night. Whatever made them, it's still out there, Mason said grimly, his eyes scanning the trees. It's still out there, I echoed, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. We packed up what little we had left, following the tracks deeper into the wilderness. Every step felt heavier, the forest pressing in closer. The symbols we had seen before began to appear more frequently, carved into trees and rocks, as though marking a path. By the time we realized we were being led somewhere, it was too late to turn back. The tracks ended abruptly at the edge of another clearing. In the center stood a single tree, its bark covered in those same strange symbols. And hanging from one of its branches was something that made my blood run cold, Sarah's blue scarf. The hum returned, louder this time. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence pressing against us, suffocating in its intensity. I turned to look for Hayes, but he was gone. His rifle lay abandoned on the ground, the snow around it undisturbed. Where did he go? I demanded, my voice cracking under the strain. Mason didn't answer. He was staring at the tree, his face pale with terror. It's here, he whispered. Whatever it is, it's here. And then the shadows moved, not like living beings, but as if the darkness itself was alive, twisting and folding in unnatural ways. Mason stood frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at the tree where Sarah's scarf hung. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the eerie hum that had returned louder than ever. "Mason," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have to move. Now." He didn't respond, his gaze locked on the tree. The symbols carved into its bark seemed to glow faintly, their shape shifting as though they were alive. I grabbed his arm, shaking him roughly. "Mason." Finally he blinked, his breathing shallow. It's trying to show us something," he murmured, his voice distant. "I don't care what it's trying to do," I snapped. "Hayes is gone, we're next if we stay here." But Mason didn't move. Instead, he took a slow, hesitant step toward the tree. Panic surged through me as I realized he was being drawn to it, just like Sarah's recording had described the pull she felt. It was happening to him now. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Mason, snap out of it. Whatever this is, it's not Sarah. It's not helping us." He blinked again, as though waking from a trance, and took a shaky step back. The hum seemed to recede slightly, though the oppressive weight of the forest remained. The symbols on the tree stopped glowing, their faint light extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly, my voice barely steady. "We follow the tracks back to camp and figure out our next move." Mason nodded, his face pale. Together, we turned away from the clearing. But the sensation of being watched lingered, stronger than ever. The trek back to camp was agonizingly slow. Every step felt heavier, the air thick with an unshakable tension. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees towering like silent sentinels. The hum persisted, its pitch shifting slightly, as though it was watching us, studying us. "I don't understand," Mason said quietly as we walked. "Hayes was right there. How could he just disappear?" I didn't have an answer. My mind kept replaying the moment we'd found Sarah's scarf. Hayes had been standing beside me, his rifle in hand. I'd turned away for only a second, and when I looked back, he was gone. "We stick together," I said finally. "No matter what, we don't split up." Mason nodded, but his expression was grim. He knew, as well as I did, that sticking together might not be enough. When we finally reached the camp, it was as if we'd stepped into another world. The fire pit was cold, the embers from the night before completely extinguished. Our tents were untouched, but there was something wrong about the scene, something I couldn't quite place. "Do you feel that?" Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. The air was different here, thicker somehow, as though the forest itself was pressing down on us. And then I saw it, another symbol, carved into the trunk of a tree just beyond the camp. It was the same design as before, a circle with a single line through its center. "They're following us." I muttered, a chill running down my spine. Mason didn't respond. He was staring at the ground, his expression one of dawning horror. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. There, in the snow, were more footprints, bare, human-like, but impossibly large. They circled the camp in a chaotic pattern, overlapping and crisscrossing as though whoever or whatever had made them had been pacing for hours. "They weren't here when we left," Mason said. "Something's been watching us, waiting." We decided to keep moving. Staying in one place felt like an invitation to whatever was out there. The tracks led deeper into the forest, their chaotic pattern giving way to a more deliberate path. It was as though we were being led somewhere. "This is a bad idea," Mason said as we followed the trail. "We don't know what we're walking into." "I know," I replied. But if there's any chance Sarah is alive. He didn't argue, but his silence spoke volumes. The trees grew denser as we walked, their branches intertwining above us to block out the fading light. The hum grew louder, its pitch rising and falling in a way that made my skin crawl. And then, just ahead, I saw it, a faint glow emanating from somewhere deeper in the forest. "What is that?" Mason whispered. "I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse. "But I think we're about to find out." The glow led us to another clearing, smaller than the first but no less unsettling. In the center stood a structure, an ancient stone arch, weathered and covered in moss. Symbols, identical to the ones we'd seen before, were carved into its surface, their faint light casting eerie shadows across the snow. Mason and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us wanted to approach, but the pull was stronger now, an invisible force urging us forward. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, my flashlight illuminating the arch's intricate carvings. "This isn't natural," Mason said, his voice tight. "This shouldn't be here." Before I could respond, the hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath us trembled. I staggered back, my flashlight flickering wildly. And then, through the arch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. It was Sarah. Or at least, it looked like her. She stood just beyond the arch, her figure bathed in the strange glow. Her expression was vacant, her eyes unfocused, as though she wasn't entirely there. "Sarah!" I called out, my voice cracking. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly, walking away from the arch and disappearing into the trees. "We have to go after her," I said, taking a step toward the arch. Mason grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "Don't," he hissed. "That's not her." I hesitated, torn between the fear coursing through me and the possibility that Sarah might still be alive. The figure didn't move, her expression unchanging. "You came for me," she said, her tone almost pleading, but flat, lifeless. "Don't leave me. She's dead," Mason said, his voice cracking. "Whatever that is, it's not Sarah." I looked at him, at the raw fear in his eyes. He was right. This wasn't Sarah. It was something else, something using her image to draw us in. But why? And then I understood. It was feeding. The presence thrived on fear, despair, and doubt. Every step we took, every moment we hesitated, it grew stronger. It didn't need to kill us, it just needed to break us. I straightened, forcing myself to think clearly. If it wanted us to follow, it meant we had a choice. We could resist, but we needed to act quickly, before it consumed us entirely. "Mason," I said, my voice low and firm, "we're not playing its game anymore. We're leaving." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Leave? How? It won't let us? What the survive? It doesn't control us," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. "It manipulates, it tricks, but it doesn't own us. We walk away, and we don't look back." "And if we're wrong?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned away from the figure by the lake, from the symbols, and the endless pull of the presence, and started walking. The forest didn't want us to leave. The path back seemed to shift with every step, the trees closing in, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The hum returned, louder and more erratic, filling the air with vibrations that made my teeth ache. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. But we kept walking. Mason was silent, his face set in grim determination. I could feel the presence pressing against us, trying to worm its way into our minds. It whispered doubts, memories, fears, anything to make us stop. I gritted my teeth, focusing on each step, refusing to let it win. And then, suddenly, the trees parted. We stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the one with the lake but no less surreal. In the center was a tree, its bark covered in the same glowing symbols. But this time, there was something else, or a body. It was Hayes. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. Around him, the snow was undisturbed, as though he'd simply dropped dead where he stood. Mason cursed under his breath, his voice shaking. "We have to go," he said. "No." But something caught my eye, a small leather-bound journal clutched in Hayes's stiff hand. Against my better judgment, I reached for it, prying it free with trembling fingers. The pages were filled with frantic, scribbled writing, but one line stood out, repeated over and over. "It knows you see it." The hum grew deafening as we left the clearing, its vibrations sinking into my chest. The forest blurred around us, the trees twisting and warping as though we were walking through a nightmare. Mason stumbled beside me, his breathing ragged. But we didn't stop. When the first rays of dawn broke through the canopy, I almost collapsed in relief. The hum faded, the shadows receding as the light washed over the forest. We had made it. At least, we thought we had. The town came into view hours later, its small, snow-covered buildings a welcome sight after the endless terror of the woods. But something was wrong. The streets were empty, the windows dark. It was as if the place had been abandoned. "What now?" Mason asked, his voice hollow. I didn't have an answer. My gaze drifted to the edge of the forest, where the trees loomed like a wall. The presence was still there. I could feel it watching, waiting. And then, I saw them, footprints, leading from the forest to the edge of the town. They were bare, impossibly large, and they stopped just a few feet from where we stood. "It's not over," I said, my voice barely audible. Mason didn't respond. He didn't need to. We both knew the truth. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a predator, and it would always be watching. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of the forest in the corner of my eye. For just a moment, the trees seemed to shift, forming a shape, a figure standing perfectly still, its hollow eyes fixed on me.